How are you today? We've been missing you.
Yeah. Dealing with some stuff.
Oh,
I had a car accident a couple weeks ago.
Give them both of us, give them the air.
and how are you doing? You okay?
I'm still dealing with it. Back pain,
I'm so
How
sorry.
you doing?
We good?
Are you going to orthopedic?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. Well, I sure didn't know because we could have had you in our prayers. About your back and healing. It's good to see you today. Uh-huh. You got a green earring. Oh, yeah. That's touching green somewhere. That's right. I wore my old green shirt yesterday. So I said, I just wear my black and whatever. But I did buy, today would have been our daddy's 104th birthday. So we always try to eat a Reuben on rye. He said the parade was his, you know, they celebrate. And I picked us up at Publix some green frosted cupcakes for our wives. It'd be just me and Diane, but that's okay. For Diane and I. Uh-oh, I'm getting the paper now. Well, I'll have to have it back to him. I'll figure it out, okay. So what you done up to? Just not feeling well?
Morning, Derek.
One, how you doing?
Good.
Well, I don't know what that's going to it's been going on. Some have it. Ooh, I have. I couldn't eat very eat for about a week and a half. And the little great granddaughter couldn't. The others have a milder, but it's still bad. Ooh, and then you go back at the ER. Because he was tough. He didn't get food. You know, in the way that I would take an off pill and I'd try to drink. So, it didn't get done now. That virus, we had everybody in Jacksonville to be playing that. I don't know what, and you went up there, and you were up there. What James ended up in the hospital with active, that's when he had the dog walkers. And they said what it did is it made those scars come out.
It is time to begin our Bible study this morning. And if you did not pick up one of the little handbooks in the lobby, please do so. It will accompany the PowerPoint presentation that we started last week.
Oh, you have one.
And I'd like to welcome all of you here this morning. It's a beautiful morning. We're expecting it, or had expected it to be really cold weather this week, but I guess the weathermen didn't quite have their act together, or I'll say weather changes without telling the weathermen sometimes. I have ordered the books, the faith books, that hopefully will be here first of the week. I had them on express. They were supposed to arrive in 2 days, which would have been Thursday. And, you know, you pay a little extra for that 2-day delivery. Well, I paid a little extra for the 2-day delivery, but it's turning into a 5, 6, 7-day delivery. So I guess they got me on that one. But anyway, we will continue with this review of how we got the Bible, which I think is one of the things that sometimes we forget, and it's a good reminder sometimes to look back in history to see how God has been very much active in seeing that His Word continues and goes forth. And as a result, that we continue to have it today, more so than ever, in so many different languages and copies and translations. But still, there are many languages that the Bible is not interpreted in. But progression is being made that eventually the Bible will be available, I guess, in every language that has a written language. Of course, there are some of the South American native Indians who do not have a written language, but hopefully eventually we'll get to that point. But before we begin the lesson this morning, let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for providing us with this another opportunity to come together as your church and to study, Father, about your word, and not just what is contained in it, but to also be aware of the lives that were given in order that we might have copies of it today. It was not a simple matter of it just simply being copied from the beginning. There was many obstacles to be overcome, many lives were forfeited, that we might have the privilege and the honor of having your word today. And help us, Father, to, as we view this, to appreciate all that you have done and those that you have chosen to print and to provide copies of your word that we might have it today. Father, we pray this morning for those who are not with us, particularly for Deborah Solomons and Michael, as they're in Augusta seeking treatment for Deborah. And pray, Father, that that visit there will be successful and they'll be able to determine more about her condition and how best to treat it. We also want to remember Chabella and her family, Chabella Reeves and her family, and as she continues to battle leg and feet problem and other issues in her life, as well as for her mom and dad. And Larry and Brenda Pack, Ken and Mona Kirby, and Father, all of our number who are unable to be here this morning because of other issues. And we just pray that you'd bless us as we continue to serve you and to make our best effort to learn more about you and to grow in the grace and the knowledge of your word. For in this we pray in Christ's name. Amen. I want to thank Mackenzie for getting those handouts printed. Memphis, did you pick up a copy of it? These will be, I think, valuable for you to have in the future as a reference when people ask you questions about, well, how can you know the Bible is true, and various other questions and so forth that people have. And so we talked a little bit about the beginning, the different languages and so forth, the canon, and the development of the Bible as it was reprinted by hand. And you may remember a group of Jews called the Masoretes who had a very specific way of copying the Bible. They counted words, they counted letters, and if they made a mistake, they buried it according to Jewish custom and tradition. And eventually, as the church begins to grow and to spread, and unfortunately by this time the church is already very much divided. We have the Greek Orthodox Church that has kind of gone one way. We have the Catholic Church, which anybody knows what Catholic means? Universal Church. That's the meaning of Catholic, the universal church. And they begin to develop a hierarchy of leadership and authority that is totally contradictory to what we know the Bible teaches us today. And initially, even this Catholic movement had a number of problems itself. They designated one individual to be the Pope or the top official. I believe today they call him, what's the meaning for Pope? Or the word, the phrase they use, it just escaped my mind. But anyway, he's like God's emissary on earth. Well, in the beginning of this particular arrangement, there was a time when there were actually competing popes. At one time, there actually were 3 different individuals who claimed to be pope, and then there was 2. And these popes were warrior-type leaders. They had an army. And of course, as time went on, in the kingship of different European countries and other countries, in order for you to be anointed the king, you had to be anointed by the Catholic Church, by the Pope. And the Pope still had a tremendous amount of power over the king. And you'll remember that ended with Henry VIII when he refused to grant Henry VIII a divorce. And so Henry VIII decided, well, we'll just withdraw from the Catholic Church and start our own church. And that's how the Anglican or the Church of England began. And during that time, we have different individuals who are trying to translate the Bible. The first translation was in Latin, which was the language of the Romans. We call those the Romance languages. And not very many people, particularly in Europe, spoke Latin. And so the Bible was uninterpretable by the average person. And so the Catholic Church actually controlled that and would not allow it to be translated. They didn't think that the average person should even possess a copy. And in some countries it was illegal to have a copy of the Bible, and you could be actually sentenced to death. But this is the first English translation of the Bible in AD 1382, called the Wycliffe Bible. And as you see here, it was in honor of the priest, Oxford scholar John Wycliffe. And he himself, it's a very interesting story. If you ever get a chance, have time to look up his name and read the Wikipedia version of him or any other, you will see what cost it cost him in order to do this. And so during his lifetime, and God bless this man, because he believed that the average or the common person ought to have access to the Bible. It wasn't just for the religious elite, the Pope and his entourage of priests and so forth. And he was also, like Luther, who came later, criticized some of the practices that were being practiced within the Catholic Church. He realized that, hey, this does not sit with the Bible. Interestingly enough, his followers were called lollers. I don't know if that's where you get lollygag from or what, but lollers, meaning mumblers. And I don't know if people just, mumbled about the situation or circumstance. We still have a lot of people who are mumblers today, one way or the other. But anyway, Wycliffe, began to put some of his criticisms in writing. And just like today, in some circumstances, be careful what you put into writing, because someone may take offense at it and you could end up in jail. But in those days, you could end up being dismembered. And when they killed people, they didn't just, chop their head off necessarily, as they did later in the French Revolution. They found heinous ways of torturing people, burning them at the stake, dismembering them, crushing them to death. So in 1408 in England, it became illegal to translate the Bible or even read the Bible. What would you think if we had that situation today? Well, in many of the communist countries, even up to the current era, owning a Bible or having a Bible can cause you to death. Under Stalin and Lenin, the Bible was pretty much outlawed. Churches were outlawed unless they followed the authoritarian direction of that particular political regime. You could not own a Bible. You could be sentenced to the gulag or even killed for having one, even in modern times. But in those days, in the 15th century, you were not allowed to read it or even have a copy of it unless you had permission from the Pope. And who do you think he would give permission to? the very elitist, most supportive Catholic individuals who helped him to maintain his position of power and authority, and then those who were the priests and so forth and so on. In 1415, the Wycliffe Bible was banned and burned, and 4 years after, Wycliffe died. And it's amazing that he was not murdered or sentenced to death in his lifetime, but he died a normal death. But in 1428, to show you how much they hated him, they dug up his bones, sentenced him for heresy, and burned his bones. And that's hating somebody pretty bad. You go dig them up and sentence them to heresy and then burn their bones. So, here's where we get into a more modern printing, and the world's first printing press, what was it? The first printing press was Gutenberg, the Gutenberg printing press, where he finally developed movable type, and they could actually mechanically print several pages over a short period of time. His name was Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany. And the very first book to be printed was, of course, the Bible. And today we see, and historians look back and indicate that without this, it would have taken years and years and years for copies of the Bible to be made available. And so it's considered to be one of the most important inventions of that time, not just for the Bible, but for printing other books in general. You can still get a copy, or not a real actual copy, but a copy of the Gutenberg Bible that was printed, and it was called the Latin Vulgate version. If you look it up, you can still buy one, a Latin Vulgate version. And one of the interesting things about it was the artistry. They painted pictures and various things on it to make it look, I guess, really pretty or special or whatever. And then comes along a name that you may be familiar with because it's occasionally mentioned in some of our classes, a man by the name of Erasmus. And he came along in the early 16th century, 1516, and he publishes a new Greek edition and a more accurate Latin translation of the New Testament. Now, here's one of the areas where people sometimes say, well, how can you believe that the Bible is true because it's been translated so many times and so on and so forth? Well, Erasmus's goal was simply again, wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. And so he saw it as it didn't matter what your occupation or what your position was in life, you should be able to access the Bible and to read it. And so his Greek copies form the basis of what's called the Textus Receptus, or received text. And this was the text that was used later by Martin Luther, William Tyndale, and some other Bible translators. And so this is where the translation process really picks up. This is just an image of that particular Bible. And so shortly after this Erasmus comes along, the individual are well known. And by the way, if we have another movie night sometimes, I have actually a movie that was made about Martin Luther. It's a very good one. I used to show it to my kids in class. I also have a documentary about Martin Luther, but the movie's really good. It kind of hits all the high points. But anyway, we know that Luther was a German priest in the Catholic Church, and he began to have some issues with the Catholic teachings and so forth. Then along comes William Tyndale. Now, this is a name that is more commonly known in Bible times. An Oxford scholar, and he translates the New Testament from Greek into English. But he was not given permission in England to publish it. Now, who had to give him permission? Well, the king had the authority, but the king had to get permission from the Pope. And so that was how that began. And we're about to get into a point where there's going to be issues between the church and the king. So Tyndale moves to Germany, where the Gutenberg press is, and he begins to print Bibles, and he smuggles them. The last time you heard somebody smuggling the Bible. He smuggles the Bible in sacks of corn and flour. And then in 1535, he publishes part of the Old Testament from Hebrew into English. Now, this is modern time. Up to this point in time, who has primarily had access to God's Word? Only those who could speak Latin or those who could speak the original language. It was not made available to the common man. And so we have gone from around 1 to 2 AD with the finished Word with only a limited number of people to have access to it and to be able to read it. And so they depended on preachers or teachers who had that knowledge to share the knowledge of the Bible with them. And so you can see how when only man has access and he teaches it and the people doesn't, how you can get splittered off into various types of groups. Well, 1535, another one called the Coverdale Bible is translated by Miles Coverdale and is dedicated to Anne Boleyn. Now remember Anne Boleyn? Anne Boleyn is the woman that King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife and marry. And the Pope would not give him permission to do so. And so the Pope says, or the King says, off with you, Pope, I'm going to do it anyway. And so he marries Anne Boleyn and breaks from the Catholic Church and forms the Anglican Church as we know it today. In America, the Anglican Church is known as what? What's the Anglican version of the church in America? The Episcopal Church. In fact, a few years ago, like the last 5 or so years, the Anglican Church has made overtures to the Episcopal Church to rejoin the English Anglican Church because of various other practices like we've talked about that some Episcopalians don't agree with, that are some of the modern trends and so forth. So the Episcopal Church is very similar, and the Anglican Church is very similar to the Catholic Church. In fact, when Henry VIII formed the Anglican Church, nothing was changed except the name and the fact that the Pope was over the Catholic Church. He was the leading authority. Well, who was the leading authority of the Anglican Church? The King. The King was the head man over the Anglican Church. And so anyway, Coverdale translates and dedicates one of the Bibles to Anne Boleyn, which, by the way, she ended up getting her head cut off too, so Henry VIII could marry another woman. He was displeased with her. This was the first complete Bible to be printed in English, according to what we see here. 1535 AD, the Coverdale Bible. So Coverdale preceded King James. Then Tyndale, coming back to him, because of his work in translating the Bible, remember he escaped from England to Germany where he continued smuggling Bibles and printing them. He is strangled and burned at the stake. Now, the way they strangled people back then is they took if I can remember exactly, it was like where they had a rope or something that had a stick through it, and they continued to twist it and make it tighter and tighter and tighter until they finally strangled him to death. And if that wasn't enough, then they burn him in addition. They want to make sure he's good and dead, I suppose. So his final words, and I've heard a few preachers preach about this, his final words was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And he's talking about open his eyes that he might make the Bible available to the common man. And so Tyndale is credited as being the father of the English Bible because his translation was primarily what later is going to lead the King James Version. And so people who are so hung up on the King James Version, if they want to get to the original language, might want to go back to the Tyndale Bible because it's more original than King James. And King James kind of worked from it. But anyway, much of the style of that and the vocabulary, is still in the Old English and so forth. Then it came along a couple of years later, what is called Matthew's Bible. And it was translated by John Rogers, and he used the pen name Thomas Matthew. It's probably one of the reasons was that using his own name might make him easier to locate and to be done away with. But it is the first Bible published with the king's permission in 1537. And then a year after Tyndale was murdered, the Matthew New Testament relies heavily on Tyndale's version as a tribute to him. You see here on the last page, he copies William Tyndale's initials in order to honor him, as an honor to him. Now we get to Henry VIII himself. Lord Thomas Cromwell. You may remember Cromwell is actually going to be one of the ones who's going to later be part of a revolution against the king. But he was the advisor to Henry VIII, and he gives permission to Coverdale to revise the Matthew Bible to make what is called the Great Bible. The Great Bible was placed in every church by the order of Thomas Cranmer, who is the Archbishop under Henry VIII. Now, who is the Archbishop? Since the Anglican Church doesn't have a pope, and the king is the head of the Anglican Church, the king has to have someone to oversee the church while he oversees the kingdom, but he's still in command. So the Archbishop is kind of the counterpart to the Pope in a sense. King is still the one who appoints him. I'm trying to think of what the movie, there's a movie that's real popular back from the 50s, I think, or 60s, where the king and the archbishop kind of get crossways because the king wants one thing and the archbishop wouldn't agree to it. A very interesting movie. I'll think about the name of it eventually. But anyway, they read it aloud during services and sermons. Can you imagine being one of the common individuals who maybe for the first time in your life actually heard the Bible read aloud? Now here's another point. Even though the Bible is being printed in English, how many people do you suppose can read it? We don't have public schools in England back then. Only the elite, the wealthy, or actually they hire tutors and other individuals to teach their children. So the majority of the average man, probably 90% of them, were illiterate. They couldn't read anyway. So even if they had a copy of the Bible, they couldn't read it. And so this was a great step forward to how the Bible literally read, that you could hear direct from the Word. And that was 1539. Now this is kind of an interesting thing. Remember I told you the other day that the Bible is the most published book in the world, and number 2 is the most stolen book? The Bible is chained to the church pillars to discourage theft. Now someone who would steal the Bible is kind of needs to be reading it. But one of the most interesting stories, true stories, that I've heard, and it was told by Ravi Zacharias when he first started his ministry, he went to Vietnam. And later, after Vietnam one of the individuals who was kind of his translator ended up in Cambodia. And you may remember the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who just murdered millions or thousands of people, maybe millions, I don't know. And there were bones piled in places everywhere. And a few people were spared to work as servants and slave labor and so forth. This one individual was working for a commander of a particular military unit, and he began to be something well liked or whatever. And but something he did displeased the commander, and he was ordered to clean out the toilets and so forth. And these were not the typical army latrine. These were buckets, and I mean, if you can think of one of the nastiest, worst possible ways where you have buckets that you have to take out and empty and clean out and so forth. And so when he was doing this, of all things, he found a crumpled page of, I believe it was the Gospel of John that someone had used to clean themselves with. Well, he had previously worked with Zacharias and his traveling around Vietnam and preaching and teaching, and had learned to read and so forth. And so he took that page, washed it and cleaned it and dried it so he could read it. And so he requested to the commander that he continue to be able to clean the, whatever they call them. And the guy, I guess, every time he used a restroom, would tear out a page of the Bible. And he'd take that, clean it, so he could read it. How many people do you know would do that? How many of us would do that? But that's how desperate this person was to actually be able to read the Bible. So, Great Bible, 1539. Now, things begin to pick up and the kingship begins to change a little bit. And England's Queen Mary bans Protestant translation of the English Bible. Now, by this point, Luther has been excommunicated. The Luther movement has started. There are other, Calvin, trying to think the other name. Others began to develop ministries off of the Protestant, what they refer to as a Protestant Reformation. Where do we get the word Protestant? Protester. Protester, those who protested the Catholic religion and the Catholic authority and so forth, and they began to name them Protestants. Well, with the Anglican Church became somewhat part of that Protestant movement because they had broke away from the Catholic Church. Now, the king, remember, he is the head of the Anglican Church. The Pope in Rome, that by this time he's settled in Rome, then there's a huge controversy and opposition between the Pope and the King of England. And so the Pope wants to seat a Catholic person on as the King or Queen of England, and to get rid of this Protestant movement. And Queen Mary is one of the first. She bans the Protestant translation. And John Rogers and Thomas Cranmer are burned at the stake because they were two of the individuals that worked closely with King James and the others in the printing and disseminating of the Bible. Later, some 300 men, women, and children were also burned. Now, that's really people who love the Lord and love their neighbors themselves. And it's like, how can these people even claim to be Christians? But that's another interesting part of history. 1560, you have people now who are Protestants are fleeing from England because of Queen Mary, or did I say Queen Mary? Queen Mary now is persecuting these people. They go to Geneva, Switzerland. I'm trying to think of the guy's name in Switzerland that was part of this movement. Calvin, there was another. Zwingli was his name. And so they print the Geneva Bible, Geneva, Switzerland. which is a complete revision of the Bible with the Old Testament translated from Hebrew. So the Swiss are a little bit more willing to go along with that. And then John Calvin comes on the scene. Now, what church today is primarily known, kind of links their heritage to John Calvin? What you say, Stanley?
Baptist?
No. Presbyterians. And actually the Presbyterians is one of the oldest denominations. If you look at, these things where you have a chart of the church and what denomination developed, you'll see that the Presbyterian is one of the very first ones, and may be the first one. In fact, I think it was established maybe before the Lutheran Church was. So anyway, the Geneva Bible, John Calvin, what John Calvin best known for? I know Mike used to talk about this a lot. I dreamed about Mike last night, by the way, but it's another story. What is John Calvin? What's the thing that he is best known for? What theology or doctrine? Predestination. In other words, predestination, that God has already selected or determined who is going to be saved. And it's like us today, it's kind of like we don't have a choice, which I'm kind of being simplistic in saying that. It's like God's already determined who's going to be saved, and if you're not one of them, you're just out of luck. Which challenges the free will of individuals to obey the gospel. Now, does God know already who's going to be obey and who's going to be obedient? Well, I assume he does if he's omniscient and he knows everything, past, present, and future. But because he knows what you're going to do, does that take away your free will to do it? No. He just knows it maybe before you decide. But anyway, Calvin developed this theology of that it was predetermined, and as a result, it challenged the idea of freedom to choose or not to choose. And then, 1560, the Geneva Bible comes along, our well-known writer and poet, William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare and the one Bible carried to America by the Pilgrims in 1620. 1640 edition is the first English Bible to omit the Apocrypha. 1640. Now, what is the Apocrypha? In fact, I just ordered a copy of all of them the other day and just got it. What's the Apocrypha? Those are the books that were claimed to be inspired, but when they met the Council of Nicaea and the other, remember we talked about the word canon? Canon means that they examined every book to determine whether or not it was an inspired written book or not. And they had a very specific way of doing it, of comparing with the ones we know for sure. But there's some of these books, like for example, there's a Gospel of Thomas. There's a Gospel of Judas. And some of these books are very contrary to the scriptures we have today. The Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church still includes some of those apocryphal writings. What they are they're separate books, just like we have the Bible as a collection of books. The Apocrypha is also a collection of books, but they're the ones who have been rejected by those early councils who examined them very closely and determined this book does not belong in the inspired version of the Bible. And there's some, like I said, the Catholics and the Episcopalians still have those in their Bibles. And some of them are very interesting reading. I'm interested to go back and read some of it would be like Josephus's historical writings to be included in the Bible as an inspired writing. Josephus was not inspired, he was a historian. But a lot of books particularly after the first century, began to pop up, and some of them were very obviously fakes that someone had written and so forth. For example, any of y'all ever read the Book of Mormon? You know, Joseph Smith finds these oracles under a rock, and, you know, he covers his head with a blanket or coat and has a special little deal that he can read it and interpret it and so forth. And the angel Mordecai led him to those. He has this entire Book of Mormon. That how many people are Mormons in our society today? A huge, huge, huge number. And do we accept the Book of Mormon as being inspired as an authorized version of the Bible? No. The Apocrypha, same deal. They are books that you can still purchase, you can still read. Some of them have very interesting reading. Trying to think of the names of some of the others. I'm sure you've heard them. So, some of these books, well, here's some of the additions right here. First Esdras, Second Esdras, Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, with letter to Jeremiah, Song of the Three Young Men, Susanna, I wonder if that's where old Susanna came from, Baal and the Dragon, Prayer of Manasseh, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and there's a lot of others. These are just some of the more popular ones. Now, we come to the Bishop's Bible in 1568, and we've changed queens now. Queen Elizabeth, they call her the Virgin Queen, which she wasn't, but nevertheless, she is reigning in England. And in 1568, the Bible is translated by several bishops of the Church of England. Church of England is the Anglican Church, is the Episcopal Church in the United States. And so they're going to translate the Bible in response to the Geneva Bible. So we've already got several translations going. Now, 1582, we have the Reims Douai Bible. And it's translated from into English from the Latin Vulgate by a Catholic scholar, Gregory Martin, while he was in exile in France. It became the standard translation of the Catholic Church. That's why that handout's important for you. This is a lot to remember. So it'll be there for you to refer to if you want to. 1611, King James I commissions 54 scholars to undertake a new Bible translation. And we have today the King James Version of the Bible, 1611. They were still speaking the King's English back then. 6 years with 6 teams of scholars using the Textus Receptus I mentioned earlier, the Bishop's Bible, Tyndale's Bible, and they come up with a new version in 1611. And there are people who literally swear by it today, would not read anything but that. Is it any better than any of the other translations? Well, I won't go into that, but I think most modern Bibles are pretty accurate to the original translation. Even the NIV, there are some folks who argue about some sections that are left out, but they usually are referred to in footnote. And for the most part, the NIV is a good translation with some exceptions, and if you're aware of those, and if it has the footnotes that say, you know, these verses are not included from this Bible or whatever, but some people would call you a heretic if you even read anything from the NIV. I like the New King James Version personally, but anyway, King James authorized this version, and even though King James never gave the finished version his royal approval, it still uses the best known manuscripts available at the time and is revised several times. Many people don't understand that either. 1629 to 1947, the earliest known copies of the Bible are found. Now we go back to versions or pieces of the Bible that are found through archaeology or through other means that have been stored. And I mentioned the other day, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but the library in the Vatican is so, it's so huge. And they have historical things that go back for centuries. And there was something discovered recently that people kind of forgot about. But anyway, the Codex Alexandrinus is a copy of the New Testament from 400 AD, and probably the best copy of the book of Revelation. It was made available to Western scholars in 1629. So this is only one book that was discovered in 400 AD, which is close to the first century. Or is within the first, close to the first century. The King James edition, 1769. Now, when the United States claims its freedom, July the 4th, 1776. So we're getting pretty close to American independence. King James edition used today is last revised in 1769. However, it does not make use, notice this, it doesn't make use of the recently discovered manuscripts that provides information that wasn't available at the time it was originally interpreted and written. These refer to the Codex Alexandrinus. It is the most popular Bible, was the most popular Bible for more than 300 years. And then 1885, scholars in England decided to revise the King James to reflect the more recent manuscripts that have been discovered in the previous 2 centuries. Their goal is to use earlier copies of the Hebrew and Greek to translate words based on new linguistic or language about ancient Hebrew. I was hoping to get up to the modern one before we quit today, because it might be the last one we do. Codex Vaticanus from the Vatican, released to scholars in 1889 by the Vatican Library, probably the earliest, AD 325, and best known copy of the New Testament at the time. There's a lot of stuff we still don't know, and even some of the Catholics don't know, is in that the archives of this Catholic, and it's not just books, but artifacts and various other things. Remember, one of the things the Catholic believes in is the bones of ancient saints or whatever that they still have in storage, and they think handling these bones kind of give you some special connection to God or whatever. Now we come up to the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, found in a cave. And by the way, recently they have found some additional scrolls further back in this particular location. And they're not, I haven't heard a great deal about them since that occurred. But anyway, found by a shepherd boy who was in the cave and threw a rock, and he heard a clank, and went and found out, hey, there's some copies of something here in these clay pots. These were made between 100 BC, that is before Christ, and 100 AD. It's called the Qumran Cave near the Dead Sea. Now this is one of the most interesting things to me about the authenticity of the Bible. In the Dead Sea Scroll, they found only one book was a complete book. The other books were part books. They didn't find the complete books of everything except Isaiah. And the interesting thing is that the scroll of Isaiah was perfect to what we have today. The translation is exactly the same as we have today, with the exception of a spelling of a few words. And as I mentioned the other day, we have words that the English spell differently than we do that are very similar, but the meaning is still the same. And so to think that we can read Isaiah today and It is basically the same, with the exception of the spelling, as it was around 100 BC. Now, is that not God having oversight of His Word to make sure that it carries forward? And so the copies of Isaiah discovered is close to the Standard Hebrew Bible, varying slightly in the spelling of some names. And they give overwhelming confirmation of the reliability of the Masoretic copies. Those are the guys, again, who counted words, numbered letters, and so forth. And if they made a mistake, they buried that copy. And so during the 1900s, more than 100 New Testament manuscripts are found in Egypt. That's in the 1900s. We're out of time. And are y'all interested in finishing this out, or you want to go ahead and start the book if we get it? I don't think there's too much more left of this, but if you've got the copy of the PowerPoint, but if you want to finish it, we can. But if you prefer, if we get soon we get the books this week to start the faith study, we can do that. Any particular preference?
That's up to you, Charles.
What?
That's up to you.
Okay. All right, so y'all gonna leave it up to me. All right, well, thank y'all for your attention, and I hope those books, I should have given Mackenzie the CD so we could have got and she could have copied directly from it. Instead, I gave her a copy to copy, and you know what happens when you copy a copy? You kind of lose some of the clarity, but hopefully it'll be good enough that it'll be useful to you, and it'll be something you can reference. Excuse me. When I was at Coffee High School, the state of Georgia approved a Bible class to be taught, and I wanted to teach it, and I was going to use this as part of the program. But the principal decided to give it to another guy who wasn't even a Christian, so I guess they wanted to get a non-Christian perspective on the Bible. Memphis, you're leading singing today?
That I am.
Excellent. It'll be good. Well, that's one of the problems I have. I try to, up here, try to sing that high note and get it down, and once then it try to go, but and when it does, it's like, I don't have that ability to get that high note.
I remember I did one last week during the evening service. I struggled on that so bad.
Sometimes you just have to say, stop, let me start that over.
I should have done was skip the verse, but I did. I said all the way through.
My voice struggles a little bit, probably because I don't, singing your voice, you have to, it's like other muscles in your body, you have to use it regularly enough.
Right.
And if you don't sing every day, I try to sing a little bit, it's not the same as leading singing. When it's a whole different note. If I go to my backyard and start leading singing, neighbors wonder, what are you doing over there? What's going on? I'm supposed to be holding church services for hours. I sing all the time, but I just don't sing the same. It's like I practice it at home, and it sounds great, but when you sing it in a lower tone, Actually, my son said this is his favorite car insurance.
Good morning. Good. That's good. Good. Good.
I remember that. 42nd birthday. 41st. Flew in with Texas. Tuesday, here in family. Big celebration this afternoon. Friends coming out to look for me. I am